I don't know about this. Are you sure it's safe?
Don't be silly. They're John's friends, so they must be all right.
Yeah, but what if they're devil worshippers or communists or something? That's what I've always heard.
That's what we're here to find out about. Here it is.
Stop worrying. They couldn't be any more weird than some of these churches we've been to.
Hi, come on in. I'm Dick James.
Hello.
Welcome.
My name is Tom.
Tom?
And these are my friends.
How do you do? Come on in.
We're not members of Atheists United, but we read about your open house in the newsletter, so we thought we'd drop by and see what it's all about.
You certainly come to the right place. That's what we're here for. Just come on in and make yourself comfortable.
Okay.
Nice to meet you. Hi, I'm Dick.
Thank you. I'm Edith.
Nice to meet you, Edith. Mary, glad to have you here. And your
Hi,
name
Dick,
is?
I'm Bob.
Bob. Welcome. Glad to have you all here and glad you could make it. Make yourself comfortable. There's a bar upstairs and open bar, and there's also coffee and soft drinks and snacks and so forth. And I may not be able to introduce you to everybody, but I'd like you to introduce yourself. We're a friendly bunch, okay? If you have any questions, just talk to anyone and they'll answer all of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dick. Thank God they got a bar. I think a drink will soothe my nerves.
See, I told you they were civilized.
Hi, I'm Aura.
How do you do? I'm Mary.
How did you hear about our party?
Well, a friend of mine is one of your members, and he told me about it. We're not atheists, and in fact, I don't think I've ever met a real live atheist before, so I came along just to find out how atheists think.
I see. What religion are you?
Well, I guess you could call me a Protestant. Actually, I was raised as a Baptist, but lately I've been going to a lot of different religious organizations.
Well, that's a good start. The more you know about religion, the closer you come to atheism.
In the religious organizations that I've attended, they talk about atheists as subversive, as evil, as devil worshippers.
Oh, I think you'll find we're pretty much like anybody else, except we may know a little bit more about religion.
Well, just what is an atheist anyway?
Well, an atheist is someone without a belief in a god or gods. We arrive at this position for many different reasons. Some feel that belief in God conflicts with common sense, and others because a scientific explanation doesn't require God. Atheists ask theists, those are people who believe in God, to produce the evidence they have for their position. Logically, it's always correct for the person who says that something exists to be required to prove it. The atheist doesn't find the various proofs which have been offered to be convincing. We have several books available which analyze these arguments in detail. Now, any future proof is, of course, a proper subject for discussion. But in the meantime, an atheist lives his or her life as if there were no God and acts as if there were none.
So you deny the existence of God?
Well, we can't deny God in general terms since we haven't heard every possible definition. But we do ask that the word God be defined before we can even discuss it. When a specific God is defined, it then becomes possible to examine the evidence for such a God. and to deny that such a God exists if the definition itself leads to a logical self-contradiction. A self-contradictory God can't exist any more than a square circle can.
Excuse me. I just overheard the last part of what you were saying. So you contend that God probably does not exist because no one has been able to prove that he does?
That's
right. But can you prove he does not exist?
No, but then that's not necessary. It isn't logically possible to prove the general non-existence of something. Well, I can show that something doesn't exist within a limited area. It would be virtually impossible to show that something doesn't exist anywhere. For example, I could prove there are no unicorns in this room, but I can't prove they don't exist at all. We'd have to search every corner of the universe simultaneously. And if we didn't find any, all we could say is there weren't any there at the time of our search. There may have been some before or after our investigation. But you see, the atheist isn't the one with the problem. It's always the logical responsibility of the person who asserts that something does exist or is true to prove their case. We're simply without a belief in God. We don't say that one doesn't exist, can't exist, never has, and never will exist.
May I add, however, that most of us feel it's very unlikely that there are any gods, considering the vast amount of time that has passed without anybody being able to come up with an adequate proof.
In any case, it's up to the person who does believe in God to provide a definition and then offer the evidence for his existence. If the evidence is convincing, we'll accept the existence of God. If the evidence is not convincing, then obviously we cannot accept it.
Yes, and I should also add that when we demand for a theist to define his terms, they're usually at a loss about what to do. They either say that God can't be defined at all, or they use a lot of glittering generalities, which in turn can only be defined by more glittering generalities. Obviously, we can't believe in a word that can't even be precisely defined. On the other hand, if they do get rid of all the self-contradictory mysticism and boil the words down to something that at least makes sense, then God begins to sound suspiciously like some kind of comic book character, such as Superman or Mandrake the Magician.
I don't understand the big deal about the definition of terms. Just because I can define something in words doesn't prove anything. I may not be able to define God, but there's plenty of evidence for his existence. All you have to do is look around and you'll see it everywhere.
So could you be a little more specific?
What about the beauties of nature? A sunset, a spring day.
I'm not sure what the question is.
You know, I think I know what he's getting at. Seems to me that the main problem is that it's sometimes really difficult to distinguish between external reality and, internal feelings. People usually talk about God as if he were a real person, In one context, they use him that way. And then in another context, they use a word to describe some internal feelings they have on their own. And when you talk about the beauties of nature, for example, that's really a subjective opinion. Now, sure, we appreciate the beauties of nature, as much as anyone, but we also realize that there's a lot of horror and ugliness and brutality and so forth in the world. And the theist, he's going to insist that everything beautiful was created by God. But then if he does that, he also has to admit that everything he thinks of as ugly and evil and so forth was also created by that same God. So that negates his whole argument, seems to me. Now, atheists, on the other hand, we would simply say that all of life has kind of carved out its own little niche for itself, or it probably wouldn't have survived. And whether that particular life form happens to please us or displease us, that's irrelevant. It's beauty and ugliness, for example. It's really in the eye of the beholder. Even the ugliest animal, ugly to us at any rate, has got some mate somewhere who thinks it's attractive.
All right. Maybe that isn't a very good example of evidence. Let me be more concrete. What about all the complex laws of nature? Somebody had to create those laws.
Yes, that's one of those classic proofs of the existence of God. That one's called the teleological argument. Now, it's true that something created those laws, but not somebody. The thing that created them it's simply the impersonal dynamics of nature. And nature's totally indifferent to the problems of our little species on one obscure planet. But when you say somebody created them, then you imply that they were designed by some kind of human-like creature who created them for some human purpose. Now, in that case, we would have to assume that this human-like God is far more complex than his creation, right? So, who designed God? And if you say that he was designed by an even greater God, then who designed him or her? So you see, you get into an infinite regression that explains nothing. Through scientific investigation, we've been able to figure out certain regularities of nature which we can either use for our own benefit or misuse, as the case may be. But there's no evidence or purpose in nature itself.
But everything has to have a beginning. Where do we all come from?
I don't know about you, but I came from Detroit.
Oh, you know what I mean.
Of course. I just said that to make a point. How far back do you want to go? The most basic law of physics, you know, is that matter can be neither created nor destroyed. It can only be transformed from one state into another. So, before I was born in Detroit, the atoms of my body were maybe part of somebody else, or maybe birds, or flowers, or grass, and all the elements of nature. And before that, well, we can go all the way back to the beginning of the universe.
Uh-huh. That's what I'm talking about, the beginning of the universe. We know that the universe began at a particular point in time, what they call the Big Bang. So how could something come out of nothing? Somebody had to create it.
Well, that's another one of those classic proofs. And that one, you see, is called the cosmological argument. And the fallacy in it is that there's no reason to assume that something appeared out of nothing. I like the aesthetically satisfying explanation of the Big Bang, that it resulted from the explosion of some matter existing previously. So we have to assume that the universe always existed in one form or another. I guess we'll probably never be able to say for sure what happened before that Big Bang. So an answer that's aesthetically satisfying could be the best we can do.
So, you admit that you don't know for sure what caused the Big Bang.
Yes, but so what? What's the alternative? If you say that God created the universe, then where did he come from? You have to assume that he always existed. So that's no better explanation than saying the universe always existed. You've only substituted the mystical word God for the more precise and non-emotional words nature, universe, or cosmos. In fact, the Catholic Encyclopedia defines God as the unknown and unknowable. So the God concept is simply the personification of ignorance. If you say that God created the universe, then all you've said is that it was created by something unknown, which is what we just said.
Well, Bob, you know, it's interesting that most believers seem to accept the definition of God as a personification of ignorance, at least on a subconscious level.
How so?
Well, just a minute ago, you pounced on the idea that science can't fully explain the origin of the universe, as though that somehow proved the existence of God. Now, another approach that many theists use is to say that because we can't yet create living animals in the lab, the laboratory, that somehow that proves the existence of God. Only a few years ago, theists were saying that because we couldn't transplant human hearts or fly to the moon or whatever, then that proved the existence of God. It seems to me that throughout history, churches have generally been opposed in various ways to science and technology. They claim that men shouldn't try to play God. And every time there's been some kind of technological mishap, you know, they jump in and say, "I told you so," and they take a really great delight in gloating about it. So their implicit assumption is that whatever is beyond man's control, that's what they want to call God. It's sort of like the sort of like the letter X in an algebraic equation. It's just a symbolic label which is used to stand for an unknown quantity, right?
I suppose the word is sometimes used that way.
Well, yeah, and if the word God is just a label for whatever we don't know, then God is simply the personification of our own ignorance, right?
In that context, I guess so.
So then why are theists always trying to prove that science doesn't have all the answers? Because the theist reasons that since God is ignorance, therefore if we admit that this ignorance exists, then God exists.
That's a pretty flimsy argument.
Well, I agree. But isn't that what you were trying to prove just a minute ago?
I hadn't really thought about it, but since you spell it out like that, I guess I must have had something like that in mind.
I have a question. I have to admit that what you say seems to make a lot of sense. But why hasn't anyone else ever thought of this? I mean, there have been many, many brilliant and famous people who believed in God.
Well, first of all, brilliance in one field is no guarantee that all of our ideas, even within our own field, are correct. Not to mention the fact that an expert in one field is often a layman in another. Secondly, religion is very emotional and bound with family relations and social standing. So people generally don't think about religion as rigorously as they do about other subjects. And many famous and brilliant people have not believed in a God. For example, Thomas Edison, Bertrand Russell, Albert Einstein, Robert Ingersoll, Andrew Carnegie. Again, we can provide you with whole books of famous unbelievers. But the truth or falsity of anything isn't determined by majority vote. Even when everybody believed the earth was flat, that didn't make it so. Many famous scientists are not professionally familiar with the literature of philosophy and theology. And most professional theologians haven't studied the arguments on the atheist side as written by atheists. So even they aren't necessarily experts on the question of whether God exists. Besides, even if they do become convinced there is no God, they usually keep quiet about it in order to protect their jobs.
You have to remember that modern scientific atheism is fairly new. It's only recently that science has been able to provide satisfactory answers to some of these questions you have been asking. So a number of famous people in the past called themselves deists rather than atheists. This means that they believed only that God created the universe, but not that he had contact with it after that. The reason for this belief was that they lived before the era of modern astronomy and the theory of evolution. So they had no better explanation for the origin of life or of the universe. Among these famous deists were deists like Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, and even George Washington. If they had lived after Darwin, they might well have called themselves atheists. That's what their enemies called them anyway.
Okay, we know what you think about God. What's your attitude towards Jesus and the Christian religion in particular?
Well, atheist opinion about Jesus varies considerably. Some say he was just a man who taught some wise things. Others doubt if he ever existed at all. No atheist considers him to be the Messiah or worthy of being worshipped. They feel that some of what he taught or was reputed to have taught is good. Some has no relevance in today's world. And other things like his belief that diseases are caused by demons are downright wrong. The sources for the life of Jesus are highly unreliable. Outside of the New Testament, there's no convincing evidence that such a person ever lived. And even the New Testament was written more than 50 years after the reign of Pontius Pilate by people, obviously, who couldn't have been eyewitnesses to the events they described. Now, when it comes to the origins of Christianity, the evidence is much better. This was one of the many religions in the Mediterranean region during the first 100 years of our era. It could well have died out if it hadn't been for the Emperor Constantine, who made it the official religion of the Roman Empire. That happened again and again throughout history. Christianity survived by getting the protection of the state whenever it could. often non-believers, were persecuted, tortured, forced to convert, or even killed. No other religion was allowed to exist where Christianity held sway. So using methods like these, any religion could succeed.
So I take it that you like to get rid of Christianity?
Well, only through education. In spite of its failings, atheists feel that Christianity, as well as other religions, should be free to exist unmolested by the state or other religions, so long as they obey the laws. At the same time, it shouldn't be given any special privileges that everyone doesn't have.
All right, let's say there is no God and that there was no Jesus Christ. What's to prevent everybody from just running amok? Who was it who said if there were no God, then it would be necessary to invent one?
Well, religions like to claim that they are the preservers of morality and that society would collapse without them. But experience shows otherwise. There's no necessary connection between morality and religion. For example, the majority of convicted criminals are religious believers, while many extremely moral people are not religious at all. Most people learn to be moral from their parents, peers, the media, their teachers, and from their reading and observation. It's part of the growing up process known as socialization. Unfortunately, it sometimes happens that a person doesn't become well socialized, and these are the ones who become criminals.
But there has to be some kind of absolute standard. Otherwise, everybody would just make up their own rules.
Well, we might wish there were some kind of absolute standard, but there isn't one. Of course, different religions claim there is one, theirs, but then they disagree with each other about what it is. So in practice, when we try to decide what's the moral thing to do in a given situation, it's pointless to look in the Bible for answers. It's so vague and contradictory that you can't find anything you want in it. And that's about as useful as trying to read tea leaves. We do make ethical decisions every day, but we make them on the basis of what we learned about ethics while we were growing up. And sometimes we have to ask our friends for advice, or even write to Dear Abby.
But there are certain standards that are adhered to throughout all of society. Why, these are even set out in the United Nations Charter as inherent human rights. If these are so universally accepted, aren't they implanted by a God?
Ethical actions are those things that society says are right. Society makes this judgment to assure its own survival. If everyone were allowed to rape and rob and pillage and kill, society would quickly vanish in anarchy and chaos. No one would survive. So you're right. There are criteria for ethical and moral judgments, but not because they were divinely ordained. Essentially, there are about 4 general principles of morality. First, the greatest good for the greatest number. Second, do unto others what you would have them do unto you. And incidentally, Plato said that first before Jesus. Third, allowing people to reach their true potential. And 4, not harming other people. Now, a combination of these principles, weighted differently in each case, allows us to solve almost any moral dilemma. In any case, decisions will then be made for ethical reasons, not because of blind authoritarianism or out of fear of future punishment. In fact, if you do something strictly out of fear, that isn't ethics, that's coercion. And that would be a violation of some of the principles we've just stated.
All right, I'm convinced. So there is no God, no Christ. The Bible is just folklore, and it doesn't make any difference as far as morality is concerned. So what difference does it make whether somebody believes in God or not? Why bother with trying to change anybody's mind?
Well, you know, it does make some difference to some people. It makes no difference to other people. It makes a whole lot of difference to still other people. Some believers, I think, spend a whole lot of their time, too much of their time, trying to placate their God, you know, by following what they feel are his instructions, what they're supposed to do. And a lot of other people make no effort at all in their daily lives in any way to do anything different from what they would do if there were no God at all. Now, atheists don't spend their valuable time in useless prayers and other religious rituals. Instead, they spend their time trying to improve conditions here on earth. And that benefits all of us. So beyond that, the atheist isn't bound to the past with these chains of dogma like the theist. We try to accept new ideas, and a lot of theists seem to spend most of their energy battling against the advancement of scientific knowledge. Now, the atheist, on the other hand, I think, is truly more open-minded about it. You see, we know that we have to make our own responsibilities. We have to face the responsibility for our own actions. In short, the difference is that the atheist has an attitude of self-reliance, self-confidence, and it's based on the fact that we don't try to foist our responsibilities off onto some imaginary creature up in the sky, you know. The theist generally doesn't want to assume this kind of responsibility. As a result, the atheist's potential for getting things done is much greater. In fact, several sociological studies have borne this out. They've shown that theism tends to breed anti-intellectualism.
Would I be correct in assuming then that you tend to be more interested in social action than in metaphysics?
Well, at our meetings, I'd say that we spend most of our time and energy discussing issues and social actions, yes.
So what do you want from the government?
Well, we basically want the same thing everyone else does. We want to be free to practice what we believe. We want to be able to meet in safety and to be able to say that we are atheists without fear of repercussions. And we want to be able to advertise in the same way as traditional religions do. You know, we also would like to have our children free of religious indoctrination in public schools. We want the government to stay out of religion and religion to stay out of the government. I'll tell you one thing we don't want, and that's a financial handout from the government. We want the government not to aid any religions. The government should simply not have anything to do with religion, either to aid it or to hinder it. If atheists had their own schools, they wouldn't keep turning to the government for money.
But if you think belief in God is just superstition, won't you try to stamp out religion if you had the power like Nazi Germany did?
Well, first of all, the assumption that the Nazis were atheistic is just another one of those attempts to turn history upside down, you know, the way media does often. And it's called, I think, the big lie technique. If you repeat anything often enough, people begin to believe it. But you see, in fact, Adolf Hitler was raised a Catholic, and he went to a Catholic school. He even signed a treaty with Pope Pius XI, who endorsed his policies, and Hitler even required all children to study catechism in school. Well, his whole plan was to reestablish the Holy Roman Empire. That's why he called it the Third Reich. Well, his persecution of the Jews was simply a continuation of the pogroms the Christians had been conducting against unbelievers for hundreds of years. As to whether we would try to stamp out religion by force, the answer is emphatically no. Atheists in America strongly support the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. We know better than anyone else how easy it is for one group to abuse the rights of another, especially when it comes to the area of religion. Also, atheists don't assume the position of absolute authority like religious groups do. We don't arrogantly assume that we have all the answers. Atheists believe strongly in religious liberty for all. Everyone should have the right to believe whatever they wish. And that, of course, also includes the right not to believe. We've suffered a great deal at the hands of religion. Atheists were among the minority groups persecuted by Hitler, not Christians. So even today, we're extremely sensitive to religious tyranny in any form.
So you're opposed to any kind of censorship?
Absolutely. All ideas should be freely discussed, including critical comments about religion and also criticism of atheism. Access to the media should be the same for any idea that doesn't advocate crime or violence.
How many atheists are there? I never hear anything about them, so there must not be very many.
The fact that you haven't heard much about us merely reflects the media's bias against us.
Because the media, of course, has to cater to the majority. A reasonable estimate is that about 15% of the people in the United States have no belief in a God. That's more than 30 million people, which outnumbers the Methodist. One reason why not much is heard about atheists is that the vast majority of them aren't organized. The few existing atheist groups have only a small percentage of this total as members. And part of the reason is that most aren't even aware of these groups. When they do hear about them, they're usually delighted. Of course, even if there were only 2 atheists in the whole United States, their right not to believe would still be protected by the U.S. Constitution. In fact, it's the powerless minority groups who need more protection than the powerful majority groups. Well, yeah, it's a whole lot easier to organize theists because you can threaten them with hellfire and damnation and that sort of thing. They'll do as they're told. But atheists are very independent people. Only way you can get them to join a group such as ours is to appeal pretty much to their sense of social responsibility, you know. Good citizenship tends to get pretty low priority when you compare it with other pressing duties such as career and family and that sort of thing.
Perhaps more importantly, many are simply afraid to join an atheist group because Christians aren't exactly best known for their tolerance of heresy. So there's a very real threat of violence, vandalism, loss of employment, and other harassment.
You say that you support the U.S. Constitution, but I've always heard that atheists were communists. Don't you support the communist philosophy?
Well, some people commit the fallacy of assuming that because all members of the Communist Party are supposed to be atheists, that means all atheists are necessarily communists. That's like saying that since all Methodists are Christians, therefore all Christians are Methodists. The fact is that outside of the Soviet Union and its satellites, almost no atheists are communists. And even in the Soviet Union, there are plenty of non-atheists. And in fact, very few people are members of the Communist Party. There's actually no connection between the philosophy of atheism and the philosophy of communism. In fact, Western atheists find communism to be anti-freedom, and freedom is very important to us. We want the right to associate, to meet, to travel, to speak, and believe whatever we choose. We want to live free of government interference. In short, atheists in the United States are very strong supporters of the American government, as delineated in the Constitution. As we pointed out earlier, many non-believers were important founders of the U.S. government. So we spend most of our time and energy fighting to preserve the Bill of Rights against the encroachment of the fanatical religious believers who would eliminate them if they could. Now, some very important and well-known Christian evangelists have actually made the statement that separation of church and state is an invention of the devil.
But Karl Marx was an atheist, so how can you say there's no connection between atheism and communism?
Well, atheism is a philosophy about religion. Marxism is basically an economic philosophy, and communism is a political philosophy. They're not necessarily related. Now, the historical reasons why Karl Marx incorporated his atheism and economic theories into the communist doctrine are too complicated to go into. Suffice it to say that about 15% of all Americans don't believe in God, and that includes a very high percentage of the most highly educated professionals. These people aren't politically distinguishable from most of their neighbors, so there's no necessary relationship between atheism and political attitudes. In all probability, only a very small percentage could be called either communists or Marxists.
Well, I must say, this certainly has been most enlightening. So tell me about Atheists United. Exactly what is it? What do you do, and why would anybody join it?
Well, Atheists United is...
Can I give that a shot? Atheists United is a nonprofit educational organization. We're chartered by the state of California, and we're dedicated to maintaining the separation between church and state, and of course that's guaranteed by the United States Constitution. And we're also dedicated to educating the public about the meaning of atheism and about atheist values. There's a whole lot of misunderstanding about atheism, and generally, most of this misrepresentation about atheism has come from believing Christians. Now, the only people who really know what we atheists believe are atheists ourselves. One of the most common myths is that atheists want to take away people's religion by force, for example, and nothing could be further from the truth, at least for atheists in the Western world here. Of all people, atheists know what it's like to have their rights threatened. Okay, now it is true that we regard belief in the supernatural as a superstition and based on ignorance. But the way to promote atheism is through enlightenment, not force. We believe that if the public is allowed to hear all points of view, including ours, then they're going to come to understand the fallacies of supernaturalism.
We also shouldn't forget that Atheists United has an important social function. Probably the greatest attraction of churches is that they provide a social reference group for its members, a kind of extended family. It's a place to meet people with similar interests and values, people you can turn to for emotional support. Atheists in particular tend to feel isolated from the rest of society, so Atheists United provides that kind of support and fellowship. We have all sorts of opportunities for socializing: banquets, picnics, theater parties, singles groups, house parties. Recently, we started neighborhood groups all over Southern California, so people will have a chance to meet other atheists who live nearby.
Well, you've certainly given us a lot to think about. And I must say you seem to make a lot more sense than any of the religious groups we've attended to lately.
Well, thank you. Making sense is really kind of what we're all about. We like to think of ourselves as sort of the rational minority.
You mean as opposed to the moral majority?
No, very much as opposed to the moral majority. We don't think they're either moral or a majority. In fact, they sound too much like something out of Europe in the 30s to us. We want people like you to help us resist those trends. We don't want history to repeat itself.
I might just do that.
Good.
Well, it was a pleasure meeting you.
Well, thank you. The pleasure is all ours.
If you'd like more information about Atheists United, be prepared to write down the data I'll give you in just a moment. We'll mail you an information packet, our latest monthly newsletter, and an application form. The primary source of information is our website, www.atheistunited.org, or you can just Google Atheist United. You can also find us on Facebook, MySpace, and YouTube. You can reach us by telephone, toll-free, at area code 866-GODLESS, or in numbers, that's 866-463-5377. The local number for the Los Angeles area is 323-666-4258. Our office is in the Center for Inquiry West, and yes, CFI selected that 666 prefix as a joke. If you'd like to find free-thinking friends in your own neighborhood, contact us for the time and place. There are local groups all over Southern California and even in other states. On the fourth Sunday of every month, we hold a general membership meeting, which is held in the heart of Hollywood at the glamorous Steve Allen Theater. At this meeting, we have guest speakers, a book table, a business meeting, and a catered luncheon. In addition to guest speakers, we have many other types of programs, including entertainers, movies, games, banquets, seasonal parties. Guests are welcome at all of our meetings. If you now have a pencil and paper ready, here's the address. Write to us at Atheist United, 4773 Hollywood Boulevard, Los Angeles, California, zip 90027. That's an office in the Center for Inquiry West, which includes the Steve Allen Theater. CFI West also presents similar programs twice a month, as well as many other activities.